We strode through the streets of Sunraiser, our feet being carried by the evening gusts that blew from the north. My brothers and I had been on the prowl moments earlier for an elf that oversaw an unjust execution, and now we sought a guide to grant us access to the lair of saints so we may continue this hunt. The wind had taken us to a posting where guards gathered outside of the entranceway, making merry with drinks in hand. Their laughter had attracted an unwanted crowd, the four of us, Tarbram our lead. He pulled us into a shrouded alleyway, just as we had spotted the posting down the street. The three of us waited for his order. Tarbram looked to his left, at the wall at the end of the alleyway, then to his right, at the street and rows of homes, then to us. Fumes flowed from his mouth, into the air, as he let out a long sigh. "The plan is simple. The three of you acquire the guide, then proceed into the lair. Inquire him about the lair's residence, then have him lead you to where the elf may be," Tarbram explained to us. "And you?" Bulin asked with a raised brow. "I will follow closely. When you find the residence, try to lure him with the guide somewhere dark, out of the guard's sight. I'll put him to sleep while he's focused on the three of you. We begin our survey of the premise after." We nodded. "Do you all have cloaks?" I nodded again, but Folty and Bulin had to search through their packs before making a confirmation. "I have mine," came Bulin. "And I have mine too," came Folty shortly after. "And your masks?" "Yes." "Oh well, let me check," Folty said, digging back into his pack. "This is no time for dawdling, Folty." Yes, I have it. Calm yourself," Folty exclaimed, pulling his hand out of his bag and saddling it back onto his shoulder. "This is where we depart. Act swiftly, young kinsman. Time must not be wasted." "Of course. Father's cloak cover you this night," I prayed as the three of us left the alleyway. We walked back onto the road, the three of us continuing our walk eastward, the wind carrying us forth. Guards crowded the entrance of the posting, chatting amongst themselves, making merry with their foamy drinks in hand. Some turned their heads towards the three of us, grimacing in response to our presence. "You don't look pleasant yourself, filthy elf," Bulin muttered harshly to himself. Folty sighed in response, his anxieties more than likely heightening. I simply uttered prayers to the Father in my head until we stood face to face with the guards. They gave us sharp looks, each expression holding varying degrees of contempt. One of them cleared their throat before asking, "Ye need help, men?" "We require a guide for the Saint's Lair," I explained. "Bit late for a guide, no?" "It quite is, but still, we seek one." The elf looked to the other guards, who simply gave it a glance back. The creature then fixed its gaze back onto us. "No harm in it. Behave yourself. We hate cleaning up your messes," it said before turning back to enjoying its drink. "Thank you." My brothers and I proceeded past the potted guards into their posting. The posting was devoid of residents, except for a guide which sat in the back. The former priest sat on a wood stool next to a fireplace. He slumped over as he slept, his ancient beard almost grazing the floor. We made our approach, taking short strides towards the priest. I lightly tapped his shoulder, which was enough to startle him awake. He frantically looked around the room, muttering swears under his breath before he gave us his attention. He squinted softly, seemingly studying us. "We are in urgent need of a guide," I said to the old man. He continued to study our presence, getting off of his stool to then circle around us. He made a light humming noise as he did so. "If you're looking for something of value, kind sir," Folty began, "we can pay for whatever expense is required of us." "Even if we must pay in weaponry," Bulin stated as he reached for one of his knives. "A weapon?" Folty exclaimed. Bulin placed a finger upon his lip and turned his face towards the entrance of the posting to make sure no one heard Folty's outburst. "Now why would a weapon be needed from you?" the guide asked, finally speaking after completing his circuit around the three of us. "The last guide had an odd request," I replied. We had to give him a weapon for the sake of symbolism. The guide simply raised an eyebrow and shrugged his shoulders in response to my explanation. "Quite the odd request. What was the priest's name again?" He had never given it to us. Must have not been necessary at the time. "Well, that's quite rude of him. Very peculiar. Well, allow me to introduce myself," the elderly guide offered to us, tipping his hat to us as he does so. "I'm Asama, priest of the Father, servant of his people, and a friend to all." "A pleasure, sir. Such honorable titles as well," Folty exclaimed flatteringly. "And what shall a friend to all require as payment from fellow kinsmen? I normally ask for a measly silver bar, enough to pay for a meal, but you gentlemen caught me at a good time. After my meager moment of sleep, I was going to attend a dinner with my clergy," the old guide explained as he slowly walked for the door. My youngest looked at me with raised brows. I simply acknowledged their confusion with the statement. Thank the Father the guide is compliant with us. We all started to follow the guide, who was sluggishly making his way out of the posting. The guards parted once more, the guide bidding farewell to the creatures as we made our way through the crowd. Most of the elves simply nodded to him, while a few responded with farewells of their own. After the onslaught of goodbyes and goodnights were finished, we were finally back on the street, on our way to the Lair of Saints. Though now at a snail's pace, as our guide could hardly shuffle his seasoned legs more than a few inches at a time. The three of us paced ourselves a ways behind him, as to speak among ourselves whenever it was appropriate. "Maybe we should have sought another posting," Bulin suggested. "Yet most of the clergy must be at this dinner. The Father has blessed us with this priest. And he must have some sway with the elves if he knew them all by name. Who knows what he can do to help our cause?" "Remember our objective? It doesn't involve our guide here, after he leads us to the executioner." "Oh, right. Him." "It, Folty. It's an it. You don't need to give it names like her and him. It's an it, a creature. It's good to stay in the habit of calling elves hims and hers. In a conversation, they may suspect our descent for them if you say otherwise." "Easy for you to say. You grew up around them. You can tell the difference, too." "Be happy you recognize my capabilities, then." "I'm not happy. Not yet." "Well, I certainly cannot argue against the sentiment." Bulin silences himself, indicating an unspoken agreement to the statement that was made. We continued our dreary march in silence. The silence wore on for quite some time as we all kept our focus on the task ahead. At least, I had hoped Bulin and Folty were focusing. I worry for them. The stress of being behind enemy lines, especially elven lines, takes a toll on one's mind in many ways. I would know. Years prior, I had taken up a campaign into the Hill, an elven town in the very same province as Sunraiser. We used a similar strategy to guise ourselves, taking the appearance of Westmen merchants before entering the town. Our plan there was to meticulously eliminate their sorcerers and chain of leadership prior to an assault. Several of our men broke while under duress, that or because of paranoia. I theorized that the elves exude some type of magic from themselves that break weaker menfolk and hinder the likes of Yern, Tarbram, I, and most of my other brothers. It was useless to think on such queries, however, as our task lay ahead of us. Our party had finally arrived at the entrance of the Saint's Lair. The crystalline path was ever bright as the setting sun gave it one last glimmer before it sank towards the end of the world. I turned back towards my brothers. Bulin kept his eyes fixed forward, while Folty looked behind himself, most likely searching for Tarbram. I cleared my throat, which caused Folty to jerk his head forward once more. He nodded to me, prompting me to turn my head forward as well. "Would you young men like a quick tour before dinner?" Azadon asked. "I would be more than happy to show you a few statues we have erected around the lair. The third appearance comes to mind." "Actually, we were wondering whether or not an elf was here by the name of Solsor," I asked as specifically as I could. "To pay our respects, of course," Folty followed up with. "We may not look it, but we are scholars from the north that wish to expand our knowledge on the Father beyond what we currently know. It would be quite the privilege." "Why, you young men surprise me. Yes, he and the rest of our elven brothers are currently holding a ceremony of their own as we speak, as they do every other night. They allow menfolk to watch. From a distance, of course," our guide responds. "Come, please come. Dinner can wait." Azadon excitedly leads us to where the ceremony is being held. Folty nudged me as we followed along. I rolled my eyes, but gave him a slight smile. The elderly man had a spring in his step, one that I wish was there before we had arrived into the Lair of Saints. He led us through the streets as quickly as his legs could carry him. The religious buildings that were built by men transitioned to tall and slim buildings made from fine grains of wood with brick columns in each of the four corners. They had 4 openings at the top, one for each of the 4 sides of the tower. I could see a bright fire burning in the topmost part. An opening in the roof of this tower allows smoke to escape, acting as a chimney of sorts. Our guide looks up at them and turned back to us to say excitedly, "The fires are alight! The nightly procession is starting!" He quickened his pace, shuffling towards this procession the elves were having. We also quickened our own, nearly running just to keep up with this old man. "Here, over here!" he shouts, pointing at a walled-off area, guards standing at a large wooden gate. We hurried ourselves over, now to a guard that stood at a smaller entrance next to the gate. Our guide made conversation with the guard, presumably making an attempt to gain entrance. Before we could reach Azadon, he was already permitted to head on through. As we neared the guard, it demanded we halt, which we adhered to. Before the guard spoke, I had taken note of his apparel, which stood out from the generic patrolman that we had seen around the city. He wore a long flowing robe that was made from wool, colored white. 2 pauldrons fashioned from steel rested on his shoulders, and 2 greaves on his legs. They were colored white as well. It wore a helmet atop its head that had a small diamond embedded into the center of the helmet's brow band. Underneath the robes was a pauldron, which was irregular, as armor on your torso hindered maneuverability, and the elves had to be quick to be effective in battle due to their weaker frame. "Before you enter this divine hall," the guard began, "know that silence is required of your kind at all times. Though we may tolerate your ignorance elsewhere in this city, you shall venerate our customs as if they were your own while you observe this procession." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded my head. "Yes, that is fine," I reply. "Fine? I say you have no choice. But you may proceed," it says, extending his arm down the entrance hall. I nod again, and proceed forth, down the stone hallway into this assumed Hall of Divinity. Although the hallway we walked down wasn't the divine hall the elven god spoke of, I noticed that the walls bore some of their history. One of the walls had been carved with articulate drawings, composed of elven armies descending from the sky into the city of Sunraiser. They were guided by the winds of the south, a breeze that was generated by their sorcerers. An elven ground invasion against the city itself was impossible due to the 5-mile-long clearing between the city and the border of the elves' former territory. This clearing they would have to trespass would make them easy targets for a volley of arrows and ballista fire, both which lined across the south side of Sunraiser's wall. Along with that, the city had an acting garrison of 4,000 soldiers stationed there at all times. The city was organized to be nigh impenetrable, but as I said, to any ground invasion. The elves orchestrated an invasion from the sky. Over the period of a few months, the elves had organized miniature outposts across the 5-mile clearing. Nothing that would seem suspicious, as groups of elves had traveled the field before, mainly to gather various alchemic plants that grew there. But the elves that stayed in the field were sorcerers, the elven wizards that had great sway within their kin's courts. In reports I had read, the city was hesitant to send men to deal with the creatures, as they could have driven their kind to war against us, but this hesitance would be their end. The sorcerers had routinely changed the course in gusts of wind that poured through the valley upward. The reports made by the city found it odd, but saw no harm in their doing, thinking it was a practice within their peculiar religion. This practice was for no religion, but for their invasion. After a time of these sorcerers changing the pattern of the wind within the valley, they enacted their plan. They guided their armies through the gusts they had created late one night, their cloth robes carrying them upward, and eventually towards the city. An army of 10,000 elves had descended from the sky, and before the guards took notice, it was too late. The garrison was defeated, and the elves were victorious, having conquered the beautiful city in an uncivil manner. "Brother, hurry along, we best not miss this procession," Foltzy reminded me, breaking my train of thought. "Oh, I apologize," I stated, hurrying along to the elves' procession. As we turned the corner of the hallway, we arrived into a room where the floors were made of asperus wood, the wood reserved for holy structures designed by man. Besides the wall behind us, which was made of stone and wood, the other 3 walls were iron bars meant for prison cells. A line of benches and chairs were present in the room, as well as 3 elven guards that stood in separate corners. 3 of them were giving us looks of displeasure. Beelan kept his head forward as he tried to distract himself from their disgusting faces. Foltzy had his head turned towards what appeared to be the inside of a chapel, where I saw elves congregate, sitting on ornate benches and pews, holding pure white leather-bound books in their hands. Our guide was watching attentively at what could only be the elves' sermon. The elven worshippers in the pews were listening to a tall elven priest who was decorated in white robes with clear crystals pressed into parts of his clothing. He gave a message in their tongue in front of a stand that held a book on it, though it was unclear what he could have been speaking of to the crowd. In the frontmost row of the chapel sat elves in similar white robes, yet lacked any form of crystal embedding in their clothing. They instead wore red scarves that covered their necks and draped down their backs, as well as gloves that slid down to their forearm. They attentively watched the priest as he read from his book. I turned to do the same, but found a peculiar sight that I could not ignore. Behind the priest was more etchings, similar to the ones I had seen earlier while walking down the hall, though these ones were much more sophisticated and detailed. It depicted a tall figure with long hair that stemmed past his shoulders, that held a book in his right and a crown in his left, similar to depictions of our father. The figure had given the crown to the elves and the book to a group of men. The man with the book read to their fellow man in the elven crowds, instructing them on how to build their homes, cultivate their fields, and many other practices that we still use to this day. Upon the head of an elf, the crown was used to bestow their foreign magics upon their own kind, some of their kind ascending to the rank of sorcerers. Each went their own way, the men going north and the elves descending south, away from the 5 founding fields. This arose multiple questions within me, as our history had taught that men simply went northward, and there were no recorded instances of elf nor men trekking towards the south. No contact was ever kept between elves and men as well. Elves were simply myth prior to the construction of Sunraiser. Why would they have known of us and known we had a similar past and never tried to establish peace between their fatherly brother? In this book and crown that were bestowed upon man and elf are depicted as being real and tangible items by the Westmen and their elven ally. This notion of such powerful items existing undermines the influence our father has had on us, who truly bestowed this knowledge and magic to us without the means of meager items. Would it not be heretical to think so little of a creator as grand as the Father? This leads me to believe this is a fabricated lie, and that there is much more to this that I am not taking notice of. I averted my attention away from the etchings to focus on the priest once more. After a few minutes of slow and paced reading, he called for the people in the pews to rise and raise their heads to pray. I turned my head toward our guide, who had also sat up and raised his own head to pray. I tapped him, but he didn't respond. One of the guards in the corner of the room gave me a stern glare, but I simply looked back with indifference. After affirming with the guard on how I felt about the situation, I averted my gaze back to the priest who finished his prayer, then shouted out 6 distinct words. They were names: Alasor, Vinsor, Sussor, Inasor, Vidsor, and lastly, Solsor, the elf we had been pursuing some time earlier. It rose from within the crowd, along with the other 5 elves the priest had called for. They all approached the middle of the aisle, which led directly to the stage the priest stood upon. Their skin was powdered white, as opposed to the other elves in the audience whose skin was simply a tan color. They stood a head taller than the rest of their kind, broader than the guards we had come across. Approaching the stage, the 6 elves strode with pride. They stepped up the stairs onto a smaller platform that stood in front of the priest's stand until they were side by side in front of the priest himself. The leader pulled powder from a satchel that rested on his side. He pinched a clump of powder tight and tossed it at the 6 warriors. This powder was white, chalk-like. Only difference was that the dust almost sought the faces it was thrown towards, as if the cloud of powder had a mind of its own. The priest began to utter another prayer, though none of the other elves' heads were raised, except for the 6 who seemed to be the only ones acknowledging this prayer. The priest then looked up after his prayer, gazed upon the 6, and shouted out the word "Sor," before the 6 shouted back the same word in response. This had to have been the Agile, the ones we had come here to discover the locations of. I must find Tarbram and put our plan into motion.